If you've been in the critical community recently, you might have seen the account The Second Story. It's blown up recently in the critical analysis community, and I very quickly realized that she and I will never see eye to eye on anything. The Second Story is an account run by author Hilary Lane that analyzes the problems that she has personally with modern storytelling, arguing what she thinks writers should do and shouldn't do in crafting a narrative. Now, this account, I want to emphasize, is not a grifter account. I'm not even sure it's a bad faith critique account. She's sharing her honest opinions and perspectives on media, and that's fine. That's a good thing, even. But I just disagree. But I drew immediate issue with her criticisms because, frankly, I strongly disagree with her notion that modern storytelling has fallen into these traps that render traditional narratives and ethics and all that moot. I also have an issue with authors who drink tea while filming, and you'll never see me ever do anything like that. So let's continue. Now, recently, Lane released a video about modern villainy that has gained traction in the literary critical landscape, and I want to, in good faith, offer a counter-argument to that. In part because I feel like it's a good opportunity to talk about modern villains in writing, something I do deeply love talking about, and how, when talking about a topic in broad strokes, it can be an issue. This is, of course, something I have done many, many times. It's extra coffee, actually. So what is Lane's core argument? Simply put, that evil as a concept is undefinable in modern fiction due to modern writing, and thus modern villains are too safe, too divorced from traditional ethical values to be cemented in reality. Now, the first half of her video centers on theory, and the second half focuses on providing examples. Because I think the examples are kind of introduced in the first half, we're mainly going to be talking about the first half of her video, but we will discuss some examples she mentions later on. Now, I highly recommend you watch the original in full. I'll be using clips from it to summarize, not as a replacement for her original argument. This is an intellectual discussion, so please, don't be assholes to this woman, please.
Let's get into it. Villains, or if you like, antagonists, are an essential component of any story. This can take a whole assortment of forms. Basically, antagonist really only means that the hero, or protagonist, has to have some significant resistance to his ultimate narrative goal.
Now, it's important to note that Lane starts her video by distinguishing the different forms of conflict.
For that reason, you can get away with things like the environment being the antagonist in disaster movies, or the protagonist himself being his own worst enemy in certain kinds of dramatic stories, or both. A villain is really just the opposition to the hero's goal.
In fiction, there are many forms of conflict. Character versus self, character versus nature, character versus society, etc. Villains tend to be most relevant in stories centered on character versus character conflict, though sometimes a villain can represent a greater conflict as well. A good example of this that I'll be mentioning more than once in this video, O'Brien in 1984 by George Orwell. He represents the authoritarian government. He is a villain, but he's not the primary antagonist because he is a representative of totalitarian systems of order. Another example of a different type of villain that represents a greater conflict is the Void from the Thunderbolts. This just came out. A literal externalization of loneliness and isolation. Or Galactus from the Fantastic Four movies especially. A personification of insurmountable entropy in the face of scientific ingenuity and familial love. However, Lane's issue is primarily that villains have become less villainous and less evil because modern creators want to establish antagonists who are more grounded and realistic.
Villains, that is to say bad guys, have been experiencing a strange evolution in the last few decades, especially more recently. For one thing, they have become less and less villainous. Taking it further, they have become less and less evil. Part of this is in an effort in modern and postmodern literature to provide all aspects of a story with more multidimensional realism.
Now, I disagree that this is a modern thing at all. Look at the works of Shakespeare. We see a mix of raw evil and humanized villains. For every Aaron the Moor or Iago, we get a Claudius or Macbeth, or Lady Macbeth for that matter. Characters who commit heinous acts, but also wrestle with the weight of their sins. And even do things that are good along the way. Claudius kills Hamlet's father, yes, and takes the throne, yes, and tries to kill Hamlet to avoid consequences for his actions, yes, but he's deeply in love with his wife Gertrude, fights to protect Denmark from war. Does this justify his actions? Hell no. But he's still sympathetic in that sense. What's interesting about Claudius is that his more modern iteration, that being Scar from The Lion King, is actually less sympathetic than Claudius in the original Shakespeare play. Even Dante Alighieri in Inferno showed sympathy to the sinners in hell, relegating his rage for those who enact systemic forces that lead people to sin, rather than individuals lost to sinning. The deeper Dante goes to hell, he moves away from sinners who commit personal acts of sin to sins that affect others, to sins that impact the fabric of society and nature itself. In this effect, Dante is more angry at those who push others to sin rather than those who hurt others directly with their sins. The Gothic writers especially made their villains deeply tragic characters, enemies to themselves just as much as the world at large. Dr. Frankenstein, Heathcliff, Claude Frollo are all deeply humanized and deeply destructive men who bring about their own downfall as well as the downfall of everyone around them through selfish actions that don't consider the needs of others. And yes, Frollo, Hunchback of Notre Dame's Frollo, a character who in modern adaptations is more villainized than in the original novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The novel by Victor Hugo showcases he actually does care for Quasimodo, and does ensure his brother is well taken care of, despite being something of a clown. But none of that erases or excuses his actions, so much as it illustrates how even a seemingly good man can become a monster if he refuses to temper his own selfish desires. Now, Victor Hugo especially, I think, would often do this one technique. He'd feature a couple of different villains in his work, one being pure evil, one being more humanized. Les Miserables, for example, has Javert, a man who is fanatically devoted to the law and believes himself a hero pursuing Jean Valjean, who he sees as a criminal. And then there's the Thénardiers, a wretched family of parasites who gleefully ruin and leech off the world around them for a little bit of cash. So yes, I disagree that humanizing a villain is a new trend. It's as old as time.
Naturally, a villain would be a human or human adjacent, so there ought to be more to him than just being the bad guy. Maybe we ought to examine how he came to be the bad guy, or whether or not his goals might have some merit. All of this ostensibly in the pursuit of richer characters.
But there's a precedent for what she's describing here, and that being Grendel. The novel Grendel, not the character from Beowulf, or the comic book character. The novel Grendel tells the story of Beowulf from the perspective of the monster Grendel, functioning as an existential tract about the nature of good. In many ways, it draws heavily from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where the creature becomes a monster thanks to his life experiences, rather than just simply the nature of his birth. Grendel illustrates how the sins of the world and the prejudices of the world can turn someone to evil. But while the novel makes you sympathetic for Grendel, it never presents Grendel as good. He's still a monster whose experiences turn him into a greater monster because of his hatred for those different than him. It's a tragedy, but not one that puts you purely on the monster's side. In fact, Beowulf himself even tells Grendel in no uncertain terms why, despite all his experiences, he still deserves his fate. A through line can be drawn from Grendel to Wicked, though I argue that Wicked is more sympathetic towards the Wicked Witch of the West.
All of this literary experimentation has its place, I suppose, if you do it right, which, as I said, we'll get into in a bit here. But something that we as a society have apparently forgotten is that most of the time a crucial factor in the villain's character is evil. Of course, I don't mean that all characters need to be Lucifer-esque, Morningstar, or even Morgoth. Although huge, ugly, powerful evil is actually a crucial aspect of fiction that is currently all but extinct.
Maybe it's because I'm a big horror fan, but I don't really see this. Let's ignore the fact that one of the biggest films of the year starred a bald hater who just really hates the hero. If you go to Spirit Halloween right now, today, you will see one character who has become popular in the last 5 years. A villain whose villainy is unquestioned. Art the Clown. An insane demonic clown driven by sheer loathing for society. And this evil fucking clown is not sympathetic. He is not remorseful, but takes every little bit of glee from flaying, shredding, splitting, and goring his innocent victims. Now, that's a guy who looks pretty damn evil. His inner wickedness is parodied by his clown makeup, but even that can't hide the visual, insidious nature of his character. Add to that the Conjuring franchise, which has multiple demons, all of which are grotesque and ugly. Can I go on? The Grabber from Black Phone wears a terrifying looking mask. The Strangers in the Strangers movies, they wear those scary masks, an externalization of their evil that hides their true face. Nosferatu, recently, the remake, showed a sentient, rotting corpse as its main villain, who actually somehow looks more grotesque than the original rat-faced Nosferatu villain, Count Orlok, in the original 1922 film. Or hell, one of the most iconic villains in video game history, Ganondorf, a character who appears time and time again. No matter how sympathetic different iterations of him might be, at the end of the day, he's still an evil overlord. He is a man who will sometimes become a complete monster in the pursuit of power, in a physical sense just as well as a psychological sense. Now, I can go on all day, but the notion that we don't have totally evil villains whose villainy is expressed externally is completely divorced from reality.
The idea of evil as an important aspect of a villain character has been shunned more and more by the pseudo-intellectual literary elite, who will tell you that black cloak villainy, villains who are obviously very bad, is childish and unrealistic. There might be a case to be made for degrees of nuance depending on the specific story being told, but this mindset isn't apparently referring to degrees of nuance, but rather a complete overhauling of our concept of bad.
The idea that evil is a childish concept, that's absurd too. But so is its opposite, that by dissecting subjective evil, we can render morality moot. Depicting characters on opposite sides of a war, that's not a matter of showing an evil character.
This is something you see, as I said earlier, in characters like Sauron, who represented a kind of moral void. He and many of his minions, such as the Ringwraiths, were so empty of goodness that they were darkness and emptiness itself. The place of evil in Lord of the Rings is often even called the Void. Tolkien understood that villainy like Sauron was not childish or unrealistic. It was merely the most extreme advancement of evil, as it represented an utter absence of good.
Tolkien, who Lane cites repeatedly throughout this video, depicted sympathetic villains like Gollum, who are pitiful rather than evil. When, for example, Frodo privately tells Gandalf he wished Bilbo had slain Gollum, Gandalf comes with reproach, saying that it was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand, and that mercy was a positive, that Gollum doesn't deserve his fate, and who are we to decide what fate people experience or not? And again, this comes with problems. What do you do with exceptions, this idea that modern villains are somehow softer than old villains, and how older villains are more villainous or express evil more thoroughly? How do we square away Sauron and Gollum existing in the same work? Different scales of villainy and different scales of villainous natures. And again, there are other exceptions in the literary world outside of fantasy that we have to discuss. No Country for Old Men and Blood Meridian feature extreme evil, but any intellectual would never call Cormac McCarthy childish. That's ridiculous. The problem is most writers don't know how to write a truly all-evil villain in this era or the past, because writing a great villain is way harder than you think. If writing a great villain was easy, every piece of literature would have one.
There might be a case to be made for degrees of nuance depending on the specific story being told, but this mindset isn't apparently referring to degrees of nuance, but rather a complete overhauling of our concept of bad. It's not difficult to analyze the progression of thought here. People looked at human characters who weren't evil incarnate and recognized that it was highly improbable for a person, even a villain, to be pure evil, that is 100% evil, which is actually true, yes. But then their conclusion was that evil must not exist, like, at all. I shouldn't have to explain how fallacious this logic is. It's like saying because mushrooms don't cover the entirety of any surface on which they appear, mushrooms don't exist. It's silly.
Now, I'm not gonna lie, I don't get Lane's logic here, because I don't think Lane at this point in the video ever shows a story that goes evil doesn't exist.
But we're going to break it down later, and if I'm in a very, very good mood, I might even provide sources for further reading.
Now, she shows a bunch of papers arguing it, but we only see a couple of pages, a couple of highlights, and usually they're introductory lines. We don't dig into their arguments, and as we'll see later, I did read some of the papers she cites, and there's some There's a reason for that.
But the point is that modern fiction writers have arrived at a point where the concept of evil has been rejected as non-existent. Whether it's Guillermo del Toro insisting that monsters are the true heroes of all monster stories and monster hunters are the real villains.
This quote about Guillermo del Toro is actually really insincere because del Toro always has villains in his films. In all of his stories, he says some really good villains, and they're often revolting. The Faun and the Pale Man, though, aren't the villains of Pan's Labyrinth, though the latter is horrific. Rather, it's the stepfather character, the captain, who's both a fascist and a selfish asshole. And a literal fascist, not just like, oh, he's a fascist because of a totalitarian government. No, he worked with, this is like a literal point in history. It's a historical fiction story. He's not the villain because he's a fascist. He's a villain because he poses harm to the main character. Then there's The Devil's Backbone, which is a fantastic little movie. And the villain isn't the ghost in that, the scary ghost kid. It's the man who killed the ghost kid, who's a thief, who's selfish, who's greedy, who doesn't care about his other peers. The monsters are the outsiders, but they're part of the natural world, made all the more clear with how Del Toro's environments serve as reflections for these monsters in their essence. It just usually is the handsome human who's the monster, despite appearances. Exterior does not reflect the interior, and our judgments blind us to the reality of a situation. It's the same plot as Beauty and the Beast. That complex tale. To frame this as Del Toro hating evil, when he has created some of the most vile villains in fiction, is profoundly disingenuous, as is saying that Del Toro argues that monster hunters are the villains, because in none of his works are the monster hunters villains. Blade, Hellboy, the Jaeger pilots, and more all hunt monsters, and they're not evil. So I don't know what she's talking about here with Del Toro's quote.
Or writers like Alex Lake, who insists that Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost was, sexy, thereby making it difficult, apparently, to root against him. Side note, it is insane to me when people tell me that Satan was the most interesting character in Paradise Lost. I found him dull and petulant, a bitter, pouting child making constant justifications, all the while refusing to take responsibility for his own actions. The genius of Milton's Satan was that he painted the devil to mirror the ways in which humans refuse to take responsibility for their own evil and villainy. I find it very telling when people call him relatable. If you want someone else's opinion besides my own on that one, you source maniacs, try C.S. Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost.
And as for the comments on Paradise Lost, Lucifer is meant to be this beautiful, seductive, tragic villain who gets you on his side because he is the most human character in the story. Now, people saying here Lucifer is sympathetic, that's centuries old. There are people who argue that Milton was on Satan's side because of how charismatically he wrote Satan. But Lane is saying this like it's some new idea, like it's a modern idea, but it's been around since the book was written. She further cites C.S. Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost, which, yeah, that's a good text to read for critical analysis. I'd recommend it too. C.S. Lewis wrote a lot of interesting texts from his perspective on different works of fiction. However, to say that's the only text worth reading is highly reductive, and it actually isolates you from different perspectives on this very complex, very nuanced work. William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell is a seminal reading about Paradise Lost and essential to understanding traditional interpretations of the text. But where she completely loses me is where she argues that she doesn't understand why people say Milton's version of Satan is so relatable, only to describe him as very human. That's why they can relate to him, because he's more human. I'm bewildered by her argument here. He's good.
Or rearranging the moral ideas in the story of Hannibal Lecter to make him a kind of moral neutral, made morally acceptable by the act of being accepted by Will Graham, I guess. Deleting the inherent evil of a cannibalistic serial killer to Fuller allows him to explore this character as something other than a villain. It also, it's worth noting, defanged and dulled Hannibal Lecter into something very boring and ordinary. An incredible feat, if you ask me.
The later point on Hannibal is more perplexing. Hannibal has always been a neutral figure. He's an antagonist, a villain, sure, but he's not the villain. In the 4 Thomas Harris novels, Hannibal Lecter is not the villain in any of them. Silence of the Lambs poses him as this villainous foil to Clarice, but not as a physical threat. because as Clarice puts it, he'd see an attack on her as impolite. Hannibal and Will Graham's relationship has always been perplexing across multiple different adaptations. I think the Red Dragon film with Anthony Hopkins and Edward Norton is actually the weakest because it actually makes the relationship more traditional. What I don't like about Lane's argument here is that she talks just about Hannibal's part of the relationship, but not Will's. Because Hannibal and Will exist as psychological adversaries. Will's skill as a detective comes from his ability to get uncomfortably into the mind of criminals and see things from their perspectives. That's how he's able to solve crimes. So Hannibal exploits that to his benefit. That is to say, Hannibal isn't less monstrous. He's just kind to those he thinks he can form a kinship with. And Will blurs this because, from his perspective, he can see the world from Hannibal's perspective and does so because of his immense empathy. This is Hannibal exploiting that for his own benefit, his own selfish benefit of a relationship, whereas Will blinds himself to Hannibal's true nature as a result. I find it very strange how Lane argues this is a negative, a case of modern storytelling, when A, it's been a part of Hannibal's character from the very beginning, in all iterations of Hannibal, but also that the villain exists exclusively on their own, and are not defined by their relationship to their antagonist. Or rather, the protagonist of the story. She's talking about these topics, but doesn't explore it thoroughly, just looking at the one villain in isolation, rather than the relationship between the villain and the hero, which I think is a big issue with her video in general. She's too focused on the villain in these objective, larger terms, and refuses to take a look at the characters in context of their work and in relationship to their protagonist counterpart.
There are two things that we need to know here before we dive into the villain abyss. First, evil as an objectively understood moral idea has been relegated to the fiction pile. There is, according to what we see in fiction these days, no actual evil. That is to say, the entire objectively moral concept of evil as a moral truth is no longer accepted in popular culture.
The concept of evil isn't around in pop culture. Again, Art the Clown, Lex Luthor, they're right there. They're recent characters. We have evil, and it's become very successful in media. But let's take a look at a second point.
Second, this is directly linked to the first point, when evil is removed from the equation, when storytellers refuse to make any kind of moral judgment about the characters, especially about their villains, this completely dulls the entire story and makes it into a pile of mush that will be forgotten long before its remainders are pulped at the paper factory. Because despite what all these people are saying, objectively, understanding what evil is and that evil can occur is something the mind craves. But the bottom line is that stories can't survive evil being removed from our entire understanding of what makes bad guys bad. What makes a bad guy bad is this concept of evil. It's not their traumatic childhood. It's not that one horrible thing that happened to them. It's not society or oppression. Evil is something else.
Her argument that removing morality from a story makes a story forgettable, again, Blood Meridian. It's a story about becoming desensitized to violence, and thus your changing perspective on violence shifting in horrifying ways. And Blood Meridian is one of the greatest books of the 20th century. Also, in regards to stories that pass no moral judgment on its characters, yeah, there's not really a lot of good examples of this that she gives. Even later, there's not a sense of moral judgment that exists in the story itself. There are quotes that she cites from authors about their works, explaining their mindsets creating the characters, but the works themselves rarely do pass moral judgment, like she describes. Not to say it never happens, but it's infrequent.
When characters and people make decisions, those decisions inform their future character. Make enough bad decisions, you become a bad person. Bad has a way of metastasizing into the rest of your character. This used to be frequently depicted in children's stories with ugly villains. It conveyed to children that evil is a thing that poisons the entire person. You can acknowledge that the person who became the villain began often as a normal, regular person. But that acknowledgement cannot negate the core of the villainy, which is that it is bad. Objectively.
Now, she argues that visual ugliness is a great depiction of inner villainy, which, look, I don't know if you think you need all bad guys to have a sign in the back that reads, I'm a bad guy or not, but I don't know. Sometimes there's more on the inside of something than the outside. What are we talking about? In a world where Palpatine, Two-Face, the Joker, and yes, Count Orlok exist, do you really think we have a shortage of villains who get ugly from being evil? And likewise, do you think it's bad that we have characters who are more within than without? That their evil is internalized? That there's, one might say, more going on under the surface? Or maybe something is bigger on the inside than the outside? What? There are stories like Wicked and Grendel that both tackle the superficiality of ugliness and how exteriors can lead to resentment and hatred towards the normal society, and how that can in turn lead to greater villainy down the line. Citing Hunchback of Notre Dame again, Quasimodo is not the villain, though he's the most ugly of all the characters. It's Frollo, it's Phoebus, who are not ugly. Well, I mean, Frollo's like my age, but like looks like an old man, sure. But Phoebus is a handsome knight, and he's beloved, and he's the most evil character in the story. Though I gotta say, a lot of villains that you showed here, Lane, they kind of embody some degree of anti-Semitic imagery, like all the hook noses, and like there's a reason we associate that with villainy. It's because it's based on anti-Semitic stereotypes that were popular in the Middle Ages. There's a reason why we don't have hook-nosed villains as much anymore, and why so many commenters who disagree with me call me Jewish as a way to dismiss my opinion. I'm not Jewish. My last name, it's not remotely Jewish. If you're gonna insult me, do it right.
Something you can't escape if you're trying to study literature or write in current year is this maddeningly slippery concept of postmodern everything. Postmodern heroes, postmodern plot structure, postmodern character analysis. And of course, included in there is also postmodern villains or even postmodern evil. Relegating this to study in some dusty library somewhere is one thing. Postmodernism is interesting and has its academic merits, but the concept of postmodern villainy has bled into and saturated popular culture. In fact, I would say that we're now living in the moral and narrative wasteland that is inevitable in the wake of totally embracing literary postmodernism. This is like postmodernism.
Despite her lamenting postmodernism, she actually never explains her working definition of a postmodern villain. She just says as a buzzword to indicate that modern thing bad, old thing good, but never explains what that means.
What is evil?
Lane then argues that she has the definitive explanation of what evil is, and I don't agree with it.
A lot of you got pretty steamed last video when I said that I was going to state facts, not opinions. We're there again. Obviously, I would not believe that the definition I'm about to give you for evil was the true definition unless I had reason to believe it was something more than an opinion. If it was just my opinion, I wouldn't bother making a whole video about it. The reality is that, in a sense, there is no such thing as evil. Stay with me. Good is a thing, good exists. Evil, properly speaking, is defined as an absence of good. This is nice because here you can get your degrees of evil. However much good is absent results in a greater or lesser degree of evil. This is what gives people this idea of gray areas. I hate that term because it muddies the understanding of good and evil. Good is an absolute. It can never be great, but it can be absent to varying degrees.
The absence of good is not evil, that's emptiness, that's the void. From my perspective, evil is when you deliberately try to do something for selfish intent that will cause harm to others and you feel no guilt about it. After all, breathing. There's nothing inherently benevolent about breathing. It's not necessarily good. It's healthy for you, it helps you, but where's the morality in breathing? But by Lane's definition, because there's no good necessarily in breathing, or maybe less good than you would like, that's evil. You see the problem with this? Anything that lacks specific morality, by her definition, is inherently good or evil, and as a result, can be judged on that scale. Whereas I say evil and good are very specific things, and thus things that are morally neutral can't be counted as evil because it's not actively doing good. You see the problem with all this? But as she says, it's an objective fact, so we gotta take it seriously.
Good is an absolute. It can never be great, but it can be absent to varying degrees. According to this philosophical understanding, there is no such thing as innate or intrinsic evil. No thing or person can exist which is evil in itself, because as I said, evil doesn't itself exist. It is simply a lack of good. The more a person gives himself over to evil, the less good is present in that person. Properly speaking, a person doesn't give himself over to evil, he abandons good.
See, The Stranger by Albert Camus is a story about a man who is devoid of feeling. Things happen around him, sometimes horrible things, and he doesn't care. Is this man evil? That's a question. It's not that he's evil or even relishes in evil, he's a cipher. There's just nothing there. Dante Alighieri depicts evil as a destructive act, one that spreads destruction to others, and the degrees at which it is destructive to the world at large depends on how deep in hell you go. But those, he said, believe in nothing whatsoever exist in a nebulous limbo. It's not that they are evil, it's that they were nothing there. I don't find her definition compelling is what I'm saying, because it encourages dehumanization. And what about those who exist beyond good and evil, like Cthulhu? They're detached from our relative perspective of good and evil, because to them we are ants, maybe even less than that. Calling Cthulhu evil reduces the terror of the unfathomable existence. Same with Galactus. It exists beyond our realm of comprehension, and that's what makes them scary. Not if they're good or evil, but if we can't comprehend them. And again, there's the void from Thunderbolts. That's an absence of good, sure, but it's not evil, it's self-destruction.
So a really big, ugly evil like Morgoth or Sauron is actually very accurately described as a kind of void. Big evil that is almost utterly absent of good would be like a moral black hole that absorbs all light and has a kind of magnetic pull.
Sauron is not void of feeling, but rather exists as a corrupting influence, encouraging those around him to surrender their base selfish instincts to the harm of those around him. Again, as Dante would put it, that's a deeper layer of hell than feeling nothing at all.
This whole thing is sometimes called privation theory, a term I hate, but I kind of hate terms in general. But if you want to, you can either open a separate tab in your browser and type in privation evil theory and do some reading, or if you'd prefer curated sources, you can look up one of the titles I have on the screen right now. For all of you listeners out there, just so you know, there are currently sources on the screen. Note, this summary does an excellent job at highlighting a possible reason that many find it attractive to reject this philosophical understanding, which is that the privation theory places the responsibility for evil on mankind, not some mysterious outside force.
Privation theory is a theory devised by St. Augustine, and it's been widely criticized by many philosophers over the years for being incomplete and reductive of the various elements of human nature. In particular, Bertrand Russell criticized the theory for lacking a perspective outside of Catholic doctrine, treating Catholic belief as universal and not accounting for Eastern beliefs on evil and karma. This is in addition to many of the points I've already made thus far. The theory was later formalized by Thomas Aquinas.
Lane cites Thomas Aquinas as a primary source for her definition of evil, and that makes sense. Aquinas was a friar whose writing on Catholic philosophy significantly shaped our modern perspectives of Western society. He combined the teachings of Aristotle with the teachings of the Vatican. However, many people have criticized Aquinas for coming up with conclusions, then trying to justify them afterwards. An example of that? Bertrand Russell, a 20th century philosopher, argued this most ardently.
There is little of the true philosophic spirit in Aquinas. He does not, like the Platonic Socrates, set out to follow wherever the argument may lead. He is not engaged in inquiry, the result of which it is impossible to know in advance. Before he begins to philosophize, he already knows the truth. It is declared in the Catholic faith. If he can find apparently rational arguments for some parts of the faith, so much the better. If he cannot, he need only fall back on revelation. The finding of arguments for a conclusion given in advance is not philosophy, but special pleading.
Now, in fairness, many have argued Russell was talking a lot of shit, considering he took a while to justify basics of mathematics, sure. But the point stands that Lane's sources aren't 100% without their own criticisms, especially considering we are talking about principles of 13th century medieval philosophy and cosmology, and then applying them to whether the purple guy from the Avengers had a point when he snapped away half of reality, you know? We'll get to Thanos eventually. Don't worry, it's coming.
Of course, the unfortunate byproduct of this philosophical foundation is that it presupposes the existence of objective good.
She then argues that if you disagree with this, that you have no definition of good or evil at all.
Although, if you don't believe in objective good, that means it's not possible for there to be an objective absence of good. Which means good and evil are whatever you define them to be. Which means there is no good and evil. Which means you can do literally whatever you want and no one has the moral right to stop you. So I guess that's nice for you. For the rest of us living in the real world, understanding and then accepting that evil is something that is definable is a critical element in appreciating and then also in writing good stories.
Which, no, actually, that's not what that means. Good is doing something selflessly for others, whereas evil is something inherently selfish or destructive. We may get different personifications of these concepts, but they are flexible definitions that don't break under pressure of different cultures. I can apply them in many frameworks. And also it establishes a difference between someone who commits evil and someone who is evil.
Just as heroism and heroes can't be examined or written well without understanding morality, villainy and villains can't be examined without understanding evil. Now here's the thing. Modern 21st century society, especially 21st century literature and philosophical thought, is largely the result of a bunch of random French guys yelling at each other in between trips to the opium den and absinthe vendors at their mistress's apartment.
I also find it funny how she calls modern philosophers addicts and perverts, but praises the Catholic Church for its purity. The jokes write themselves in that case. But she argues that postmodern belief exists to allow people to do just anything they want.
My point is that our modern understanding of good and evil is not this enlightened thing that resulted from magnificent minds. Mostly it's garbage, intended to provide society with the greatest level of permissiveness reasonably allowable. Some of it is actually kind of interesting. Most of it is garbage. We're getting off topic. What I'm saying is that postmodernism has some interesting ideas, like I said, but what we have left now is an insane soup. It's literally impossible to form any kind of solid opinion about anything objective within postmodern thought. No matter how much you read, it seems to come down to the idea that man decides for himself both what is real and what is right. Sure, I'm oversimplifying, but challenge any postmodernist to prove that wrong.
Which, sounds like a dog whistle to me, but it could be entirely unintentional. I don't know. I'll let you decide that for yourself. That if saying modern society and our questioning of norms allows us to commit sin is a dog whistle for anything.
So what does all this postmodern business mean for villains and villainy? Put simply, the postmodern understanding of evil as such is that it doesn't exist. And I don't mean that in the classical sense that evil is merely an absence of good. I mean it doesn't exist in that it can't be defined. I mean that to postmodern literary theorists, which is everybody in every English lit department, in every publishing house, in every literary agency, the concept of evil, for lack of a better term, is a social construct subject to the whims of every individual person. They'll tell you that, like morality, evil is what society in a given time has decided is unacceptable. That's it. Therefore, examining evil in storytelling will tell the stuffy English lit majors what ails society.
She argues that evil in most stories nowadays exists as an extension of one of society's problems, as a personification of a buzzword or something, which, it's actually one of the core conflicts in media, character versus society, we talked about with 1984. Remember that all that way back in the beginning of the video? But Lane here is arguing that all evil characters that represent societal fears are thus bad. But wouldn't that make O'Brien in 1984 bad by your definition? And it's not without merit that a lot of villains do represent some societal fear. Freddy Krueger, for example. He is a villain, but he exists as an extension or representation of the classic religious doctrine, the sins of the father are to be repaid upon the son. Now, the parents of Springwood and Elm Street kill Freddy because he killed their kids and the law couldn't help them. But Freddy then gets revenge by killing their kids, and the parents turn a blind eye to the consequences of their own actions, even as the kids are dying. Even though it's justified what they did, they're still ignoring the consequences. Craven loved playing with evil as a concept. Watch The Hills Have Eyes for that idea, for the idea that all of our society norms break down once we're put into a savage, uncivilized location.
If you ever want to check and see if an English lit major is worth your time and money, you can go online and read the dissertations of lit majors from colleges all across America, which is, something I did because I'm that kind of crazy. And you see this pervading line of thought running through these papers. I was searching mainly for theses on the subject of villainy, but this is all I found. Paper after paper about how villainy is a social construct and what specifically various iterations of villainy say about society at a given time.
She then decides to humiliate a bunch of college kids for their college term papers. By the way, this is the point when I was watching the video initially that I realized I had no guilt responding to her at all. If she's gonna mock college kids for their essays and papers just to show the cover pages without any actual citations and sites and points like that, but show their names and hold them accountable, then I can respond to her video easily. Also, I decided to do something that most YouTubers don't do, or most commentators don't do. Actually read the term papers she cites. And yeah, guess what? She's either misrepresenting or oversimplifying their arguments. Can you imagine that? One essay, for example, that she cites is about theatricality of evil in Batman stories, which, yeah, isn't close to what she's saying right here. Another is arguing that Shakespeare makes his villains alluring through the use of soliloquy. Again, not what Lane is talking about, but she frames it like it's some postmodern concept, when in actuality, the student is just saying, oh hey, Shakespeare shows you what the villains think, and that's good. Like, come on. Either Lane lied about the college papers in order to make a point, or she didn't actually read them, thoroughly enough anyway. Or maybe took a bunch of screenshots and dumped it on without reading them at all, period. Either way, it's not reflective of a talented video essayist to make these citations without going into specific examples. And ultimately, she is setting up a framework for what is and isn't evil. It is a foundation upon which she can build, right? So what is she building?
There's a foundational presupposition at play here. According to modern literary thinking and philosophical thinking, evil itself is not a thing that can occur. This is just a given to a modern lit major. Evil can't be defined because good doesn't exist, philosophically speaking. So you see, to the modern writer, there is no good and there is no evil. Therefore, all stories do is tell us what society thinks at a given time. Therefore, anything that is marked villain by society and put in the antagonist column in a story is currently the victim of some kind of social stigma. You see?
Now, here she argues that all modern villains are victims of postmodern thought. That evil, that being what society deems evil, is just misunderstood by society, or something we will later come to reinterpret as maybe not so bad, like Del Toro's monsters or the Phantom of the Opera, characters who are at first monstrous, but when you take a look at them a little more closely, they're sympathetic. Or Quasimodo, for that matter. And I chose those examples before deliberately because those stories often do contrast evil with something we perceive as monstrous in society, indicating that our subjective perspectives are not all that they are cracked up to be. Except there's one problem. A lot of stories have characters who enact societal taboos who are still not evil, but are bad guys. Take the Punisher. The Punisher is a mass murderer who kills criminals. The entire philosophical question of the Punisher is if the Punisher has just become as evil as the men he kills. Point is that no, what Lane is saying doesn't quite make sense. Just because fiction asks questions about our concept of morality doesn't mean we abandon the idea of right and wrong as a concept. And then she cites something I was talking about this whole time.
You see this a lot with postmodern examinations of old stories like Beowulf, where the monster interpreted to be some kind of victim.
Grendel and Beowulf, which again is a reference I made earlier. There is a method to my madness here, you know? I bet you just thought I was saying stuff early in the video to keep your attention, but no, I was actually planning this out. I planned a whole thing around this essay. I am very smart. Please praise me.
According to writers these days, the only modern socially appropriate way to approach the villain is to apply one or more of the following postmodern principles of morality.
Lane's 3 modern principles are concerning.
First, you can make the villain sympathetic. Because, you know, he's not actually a villain, he is just the victim of current year social constructs. Or you can make him a symbol for modern acceptable social evil, whatever that is. I think currently it's fascism, but I haven't checked in a couple hours, so it might be something else now.
Arguing that a villain who represents societal evils and joking it's fascism is... God, that's a dog whistle right there. It just keeps getting louder, doesn't it? It just keeps getting a little louder and louder. But yeah, I guess she hates 1984 then, considering O'Brien is a representative of a fascist government regime. Further, let's go back to Del Toro, whose villains often do represent the worst features of society, often an oppressive, conforming element of it, whether it's America in Shape of Water or fascist Spain in Pan's Labyrinth. Michael Shannon's character in The Shape of Water is a figure of 50s American conformity, who is literally rotting before our eyes while attacking gay and black people, and deaf people, and a fishman. He's also just an asshole. The captain from Pan's Labyrinth, he is a violent sociopath and a fascist, yet he's the villain because of the personal threat he poses to our protagonist and her mother. Him killing a father and son out on a hunting trip and then stealing the rabbits they hunted has nothing to do with him being a fascist. He's just an asshole. That's the point. Even his own men are disturbed by him. He isn't just evil because he represents a societal problem. He's evil because he's evil. Or hell, again, Art the Clown. There's no message about society with Art the Clown. He's just a monster who does terrible things.
In other words, the villain isn't a villain. He is either a victim of social misconceptions, or his past, or the patriarchy, or whatever. Or he's not so much a villain as he is a stand-in for the writer's idea of what is wrong with our society right now. There's a reason so many of the biggest popular productions these days feature fascism or the patriarchy or whatever happens to be big and trending on social media as the big bad guy.
Imagine saying with your whole chest that Andor or The Handmaid's Tale are bad depictions of character versus society. Again, the same core conflict present in 1984 and Brave New World. Also, Handmaid's Tale is also about fascism. It's not just about the patriarchy. It's just that the fascism and patriarchy are connected. And you know, other people have... It's not an essay on The Handmaid's Tale. I just think she's saying things that are a little ridiculous.
It's worth noting, from time to time, there's also a third option. The one in which the villain, you know, was right all along, and he just went about it the wrong way. Done right, this is the only variation on modern villainy that's even somewhat tolerable. It's just basically never done right.
The villain being right all along is never done well, huh? Well, I can't think of any examples like that.
You built these weapons to destroy us. Why?
Oh, it's not so surprising, really. Mankind has always feared what it doesn't understand.
Before we get into examples, I want to take a moment to talk about the problem with the overemphasis on sympathetic villains. We'll discuss this a little more when we look at examples, but this is one of those good things, bad things situations.
Then Lane tries to argue that you shouldn't humanize your villains. Too much, anyway.
The idea with humanizing or making your villain sympathetic is that it makes the character more interesting. In the cases of characters who are not, you know, Lucifer as Morningstar or Morgoth, in other words, characters who are people too, it also lends believable realism to the story. This is all true. But the problem comes when the writer tries to locate the specific ways in which the villain ought to be humanized.
Like, she argues it can be done good, but her argument that you should be mindful of what good traits of goodness you put in, that you sprinkle in, that's not necessarily a bad point, actually. She has a point here.
When a character who is a villain abandons goodness as he gradually comes to embrace, for lack of a better term, the dark path, he will, in a sense, pick and choose what good remains. And the goodness that he chooses to hang on to will be in keeping with his character. A narcissist who is only out for his own benefit might still experience enough of a fatherly bond to tuck his daughter into bed at night, sure, but he's unlikely to be moved to action by the sight of some beggars in danger. A lot of unrealistic, sympathetic villains stem from this problem. The writer started out with the best of intentions, but wasn't sure where specifically the villain's goodness still remained.
I mentioned before that a lot of writers have a hard time writing great villains. And yeah, that's true. Again, look at Frollo, Hunchback Notre Dame. He has good traits in the book, he supports those in his circle, but objectifies those outside of it. Again, all the good traits you put in, you gotta be mindful how they affect and influence the other features. His kindness towards Quasimodo becomes a foil to his dehumanization of Esmeralda, especially when he treats Quasimodo more and more cruelly as his desire overwhelms his common sense. By showcasing how good traits of a character are diminished over time, you can illustrate how deeply they're diving into their base, dark instincts. The problem is Lane acts like modern writers have characters doing seemingly random acts of good, and that reduces their characters.
Most often, this is due merely to the fact that most people see villainy as a social construct. So, to those writers, goodness and badness are pretty random and open to subjective interpretation. So they just randomly pick good traits that they think are most likely to tug at the emotions of the audience. The traits are not usually consistent with the person's character. So it creates contradictions that don't ring true. This kind of thing is done by writers to create uncomfortable contradictions that would supposedly be compelling to the audience. But in the end, it's just contradictory. But aside from issues of bad writing like that, you probably don't really need me to tell you that most modern writers' sympathetic villains have just become a synonym for the real hero of the story, which again goes back to a rejection of the concept of good and evil.
As we will see when we get to Thanos, I think that this is less a problem that writers are having, and more a problem that Lane doesn't understand why the writers are doing what they're doing, but argues that she does. You will see what I mean when we get to Thanos, because trust me, that puts everything in perspective. But I don't entirely want to say I disagree with everything Lane's saying. A good example of this is the manga Fushigi Yugi, which I've referenced a bunch of times in this channel. The villain of Fushigi Yugi is a character named Nakago, who doesn't do a decent, unselfish thing in the entire story. But at the very end of the story, we learn his tragic past. And mind you, this is a flashback that happens right after when the main protagonist has rammed his fist through Nakago's chest. We are meant to sympathize with Nakago, knowing what happened to him and what led him to his villainy. But none of it excuses any of the murder or assault he committed along the way. It's also worth noting, I should say, that Uetase, who was a very young writer at the time, had a crush on Nakago and admitted it in the margins of the manga. And so rewrite the backstory that she had in mind because she wanted to make sure Nakago had a happy ending. At least Uetase was honest about it, and she's gotten better as a writer since then.
In a postmodern literary society such as our own, we can no longer just, engage with the story. It all has to be meta. The story isn't what's important. What's important is the story's meditation on, or examination of, or deconstruction of some aspect of society. This isn't a villain. It's what evil, vicious society has decided unjustly is villainous. Objective reality no longer exists. Now it's just your truth and my truth and social constructs.
But, Lane loses me when she starts rambling about deconstructions, because Scream is a postmodern villain. One of the most obvious postmodern villains because Scream is self-referential to the medium of horror itself, and indeed discusses how each villain exists in correlation to the others, not just in terms of the timeline of the story, but also a meta sense about the story itself. Stories talking about stories. And the thing is, all the ghost faces, they're all evil, they're all diabolical and murderous and violent, and none of them are sympathetic because they're postmodern. They're not sympathetic at all. But my issue is that Lane isn't really engaging with examples at this point in time. She's just throwing out a lot of ideas, and her audience will listen to it and go, yeah, I can think of something. I can think of something like that. That makes sense. I can think of like one or two things. It's the responsibility of a video essayist to give context throughout the whole video, to layer statements with examples, to cement and anchor an idea so it doesn't go too off the walls. You gotta say, here's what I'm talking about. And if you don't anchor your speculation to an example, your audience will come up with examples themselves and may take that in directions you're not intending, or maybe do the heavy lifting for you. Because the reality is this: yes, a story of personal viewpoints can make a story meaningful.
If you think such a world can ever create a meaningful story, much less villain, you're in for a long, rude awakening.
A lot of damn good books are about perspective and subjective morality. Frankenstein, great example of that. Blood Meridian, another example of that. Les Miserables centers on a thief and the dredges of society. Yet they're all more sympathetic than society itself. Why do I feel like if Lane read Les Mis, she'd say Javert is the good guy?
In the same way that modern artists have to perch next to their random canvas of cerulean smears and banana peels and then explain to passersby that it's a meditation on, post-colonialism. That attitude permeates not just art, but also literature.
I also gotta say right here, at this point in the video, Jane's jabs at modern art made me realize the perfect counter to everything she said. A director whose work would drive her nuts because of how disconnected from concrete reality it is. David Lynch. Can you imagine her watching Eraserhead and trying to just grapple with these ideas it presents? Or Twin Peaks for that matter? The sheer contempt for some imaginary artist that she has, that's born out of a refusal to engage with that art. It's like when they make art, engage it on the artist's terms to follow with what they're saying.
You and I and everyone with a brain knows that this is boring. Approaching villains like this is boring and also toothless. Stories are meandering, pointless wastelands that can't do anything because without the certainty of some kind of good and evil, nothing actually matters. There are no heroes, there are no villains, who cares who wins, who cares what happens in the end, nothing matters, let's all go home and eat dirt or whatever.
Hell, I would argue she would hate Prince Mononoke, a movie that argues that a lot of fights of good and evil are born from a total refusal to understand the other side. That bad actors can play good people for fools, and that ultimately you must see the world through eyes unclouded by hate to truly understand what's going on. I feel like Lady Eboshi would give Lena migraine for sure, because she is a good woman who does bad things in service of those she cares about. But she's still a destructive character. Lane insists on approaching villains like this is boring. Like a character like Eboshi would be boring and unremarkable. But Hayao Miyazaki has specialized in showing villains not as evil, but as people who are out of balance with the rest of the world. Hell, her viewpoint of evil is very Western. And it's surprising because later she does mention a Japanese film, but doesn't engage the Japanese film with Eastern perspectives, but rather the same Catholic perspectives that she used to define evil at the beginning. But with Eastern works, you see a lot of stuff discussing the subjectivity of morality, of ethics, where the protagonist is sometimes left with multiple options and no clear sense what is good or not, but rather what is more harmful to them and not. And a good example of that is the Korean film The Wailing, which is brilliantly a story about societal prejudice, paranoia, and charlatans, as well as a pandemic exorcist film. And if you haven't seen it yet, you'll get what I mean when you watch it. Seriously, watch The Wailing. It is fantastic.
What is happening? Okay, that's all theory. So let's talk about what happens when you get hip deep in postmodernism and start screwing around with this like a toddler. We'll do some bad examples and some good examples.
After arrogantly prescribing modern media as meaningless dirt, she then explores examples of what she is talking about. Now, I've not seen all the pieces of media that she discusses here, so I will be avoiding discussing them as they come. I will also not discuss Hannibal a second time, because I feel like my initial discussion of her thoughts on Hannibal are sufficient counter what she says here. It's just an expansion of what she said, and she still never discusses Will Graham's perspective outside of him being like a wooby kind of love interest for Hannibal in the show. I've also not seen The Fall or Scandal, so I will leave them to stand on their own. Someone else who's seen them can make a counter argument there. But I want to jump into a discussion specifically of Gladiator and of the Avengers movies, because I feel like I can offer sufficient responses to those examples to illustrate that her perspectives are a little simplistic.
Evil and villainy can also be nuanced and complicated. A good example would be Commodus from Gladiator. We understand that his father's refusal to name him as his heir caused him pain. We understand how he was jealous of Maximus. But we also understand how these things didn't create his villainy. They were flaws in his character that compelled him to, at crucial moments, make the choice that abandoned good, killing his father being the first big one.
Now, Lane discusses how Commodus shaves off good, but refuses to engage with how Commodus's villainy is born primarily from his own selfish desires to be loved.
But then you see how each successive bad choice shaved off more and more good and corroded his character more and more until he reached a point when he intended to probably kill his nephew, a child, while also using his biological sister to produce a pure heir.
She treats Commodus's lust for his sister as purely practical to produce an heir, and not as him being this depraved monster who fetishizes all forms of admiration and affection. I feel like you're missing something from the story. I probably shouldn't put hot tea in a horn. Whatever. She doesn't mention him setting up the gladiatorial games as a distraction for his ineptitude as a leader, or murdering his father to prevent Maximus from becoming an emperor who would turn Rome into a republic. He's a pathologically immature human whose selfish desires drive him to hurt those around him.
And I particularly liked how they dressed him all in white for his final fight with Maximus. This might seem ironic, as perhaps it should have been black, but white in this case reminded me of unpainted clay. Unpainted, it has no personality, no identity. It's incomplete. Incompleteness Blankness was his final evil form. It was like he had stripped himself of everything, and now all that was left was an artificial construct held together by cloth and armor.
By the way, this scene right here, but the wearing white bit, Commodus does not wear white because he's like clay, unformed. He wears white because he wants to frame himself as the hero, and Maximus, who he forces to wear black over his bleeding robes from where he stabbed him, is presented as the villain. He has to be loved by those around him and can't stand anyone who's liked more than him. So he frames himself as the hero, destroying his enemy, who he frames as a villain. And, of course, puts him in heavy armor that hides the fact that Commodus stabbed him in the gut before the match started. It's very important, whereas when Commodus is killed by Maximus, it is done in the open, on the outside, unblemished by armor, unprotected by his armor, right in the neck. His true self, his real flesh, not a facade he puts on for those around him. A simple read, but it is at least more grounded in the narrative and Commodus' desires than the abstract philosophies of a 13th century monk. The problem is that Lane forces Commodus to fit her framework, without actually analyzing what that means in the context of his world. Commodus is a positive example that Lane cites, and she doesn't seem to discuss why Commodus is so repulsive as a villain, just simply that he's evil. But if we boil it down to just Commodus had no good in him, then what makes Commodus any different than Michael Myers? Or Anton from No Country for Old Men? How are they different? Well, I'd say they're very different characters, but by Lane's definition, they're all the same type of evil, therefore they're all very similar. But the part where I realized she has no clue what she was talking about was Thanos, a character who literature essayists love to completely fail to understand. There are a lot of dumb takes about Thanos. They'll tell you that Thanos is sympathetic because he was basically right, that he made a lot of good points about why he should eradicate half the universe. And these people are fucking idiots.
Throughout the lead up to his climactic introduction, he was the ultimate terrifying evil force bent on probably some kind of universal destruction. When at last we got to know this character and his motivations, we received the combined force of postmodern villainy and emotional morality. Firstly, he was made to be compelling by showing him perhaps loving his daughters, perhaps not, perhaps even being a little benevolent. Then, when he presented his case for wiping out half of the universe to save the other half, it was hard to fault his logic, or at least the morality of his motivation as it was presented. Here's the issue with all that. It's fine to make your villain sympathetic. It's fine to give him compelling motivations. But if the writer doesn't understand morality and good and evil, all of this falls flat.
The reality is, Thanos was delusional. He believed his plan would work, but there was no evidence that it would work.
If life is left unchecked, life will cease to exist. It needs correction.
You don't know that!
He based it off of his own delusional perspectives and sights. Oh, the planet that Gamora came from, it's a paradise now. Well, how do you know killing half people had anything to do with that? He claims he loves his daughters, but tortures his children. Gamora and Nebula both hate Thanos for a reason. Nebula had her body peeled layer by layer away and replaced with machine. He doesn't hesitate to kill Gamora at all if it means furthering his goals. And that means that he kills the one voice of reason he has around him. The voice that tells him, you don't know what you're doing. You have nothing to base what you're talking about on. Thanos is terrifying not because he's evil, but because he causes harm to our protagonists, completely breaking them on a physical and emotional level, rendering their efforts and plans for nothing. And when Thor finally does kill him, it's a hollow victory, because it means nothing. Healing him doesn't undo any of the harm Thanos dishes out. He wins! The whole of Endgame is about undoing Thanos' damage rather than stopping Thanos, because he's already won.
With Thanos, the writer went too far, making him compelling and understandable. So far, in fact, that for the final film, he wasn't scary anymore. He was just this guy holed up in some backwater shack. Because when you try to say, listen, maybe he's a little right, but you, the writer, don't know how right, because you don't understand or accept objective reality, you end up giving him too much good. If he has too much good, he's not scary anymore because he's not evil. He makes moral sense to some degree, which negates his villainy because it's too much good.
But Lane sees Thanos in the shack as a sign that he's, divorced from, he's not scary anymore, he's not intimidating. but ignores the fact that Thanos is hanging out in that farmland because A, he won, and B, winning, using the Infinity Stones, burned the flesh off of his skin. He can't move anymore. Also, Thor rammed a big axe in his chest. Further, a variant of Thanos returns in the final act of Endgame with less power than he had in Infinity War, and he is absolutely a threat, and is absolutely intimidating and badass. She talks about these movies like, oh, Thanos loved his daughters, and that's a sign that he's really good, actually. Even though Gamora and Nebula both find this love as a delusion. It's humanizing, but it's different from making him sympathetic.
Couple that with an overabundance of sympathizing, and now he's not entirely wrong, and he's not really hateable. Audiences will subconsciously cease perceiving him as villainous or evil, or even just scary.
What do you mean you can't fault his logic? He was convinced killing half of the universe would make resources or whatever, but bases on no tangible evidence, just his observations. There is no logic to what he's saying. He's a madman. Gamora constantly points out in the film itself that Thanos doesn't have any proof his plan will work, but Thanos believes his plan will work. And that fanatical contradiction makes him interesting and a threat. It's a compelling component of the character.
This is partly an outcome of being unable to morally commit to something. The writers couldn't bring themselves to 100% say Thanos was morally wrong, because that would, suggest that there is such a thing as moral wrong. So they had to leave themselves an out, a little coward's escape hatch, oh, well, maybe he had a point. I don't know. Who am I to say? Cowards.
Which hits the fundamental issue with everything Lane says. Evil has nothing to do with how intimidating a villain is. How much of a threat they pose is what makes a villain intimidating. Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the more sympathetic slashers in horror. He is the least evil member of his family. He is a handicapped man who freaks out when these teenagers show up at his house and he doesn't know what to do. And there's scenes where he's like panicking in the basement with all these teenagers dying around him that he kills. He wants to make dinner for his family before his dad gets home from work, and he's scared his dad's going to yell at him. But he's a fantastic villain because he is a gigantic man with a chainsaw who cannibalizes his victims. He is terrifying. He's way more frightening than Chucky, who is undeniably more evil than Leatherface due to his sadistic nature. The reason Hannibal is a great villain isn't that he's evil. He is always surrounded by way more evil characters. Buffalo Bill and Dolarhyde are way more vile characters than Hannibal. But he's a great villain who's more memorable than those because he's a threat to the character's inner well-being. Will Graham struggles to remain anchored to humanity and not be swallowed up by Hannibal's perspectives. Clarice is forced to deal with her own trauma as Hannibal picks at her brain out of morbid fascination. The problem isn't the writers committing themselves to ideology, it's whether or not the protagonist is threatened to lose something in the conflict. Thanos and Commodus don't need to be evil to be threatening. They need to pose a threat to be threatening. And to prove that, let me talk about one of the most evil modern villains I can think of. The director from a Serbian film. Yes, a Serbian film. That one. The horror film that's so extreme I can't even talk about it. Yeah, that one. We're going there. This director wants to make extreme art that will elevate Serbian cinema. And does this by forcing and drugging his actors into doing unspeakably evil things. And they happen on screen. You see all of them. I can't even show footage from this film because of the horrible things that happen in the movie. YouTube would immediately demonetize it. I can't even describe it. That's how bad they are. But despite forcing the protagonist to do unspeakable evil, no one cares about this villain. Because he isn't the threat. The main character is the threat. He is so minuscule a character in this story, which is a showcase of depravity, that we barely even notice when he gets killed off. On the other hand, we have a movie like Ju-on, The Grudge, which features one of the scariest villains ever, Kayako and her son Toshi, who are both slain by Kayako's husband, and now haunt the house that they were killed in as a death curse. If you step inside this house, you will die. They are eternally stuck in their own horror and pain and rage, which drags everyone else into it. They are not evil at all. They're an aberration on society. They are the victims of sin that now echo what was done to them to everyone else. They are a reminder of mankind's cruelty, rather than someone who perpetrates it. And that's made all the more clear whenever Kayako's husband's ghost shows up, and you see what true evil is like in comparison. And he's not as scary as those who experienced it firsthand, as a representation of sin. Alternatively, there's a villain like Asami from Audition. Terrifying, but her motivation is essentially getting back at men who have used her. That's not scary, that's not evil, but her actions are frightening. She is terrifying not because she's a particularly evil person, but because she's absolutely crazy. Oh wait, actually I forgot, she does hurt that dog, so yeah, she deserves what she gets. She needs to go. Point is that I don't think Lane's definition of evil works. I don't think her perspective makes sense, and I think that when you look at film from a perspective that's more unbiased by pre-existing notions of good and evil, you see that stories can tell a perspective that's compelling. Because ultimately stories are meant to convey ideas and meaning. If we allow ourselves to give into a work, to see what it's trying to say, and discuss a work on its terms, rather than prescribe it in some culture war that we're discussing, we will get more out of the works we discuss, and get a stronger sense how to create a narrative that is compelling and convincing.
Kitty, 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 kitty.